My dad asked me, "Why do you keep coming home with black eyes?" The blood from my split lip had already started to coagulate by the time I walked through our front door at midnight. This was the 7th beating in 3 months, and each one was getting harder to explain away to the one person who still gave a damn whether I lived or died. My father sat at our kitchen table in his work clothes, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and exhaustion carved into every line of his weathered face. "Got jumped after the basketball game," I lied, grabbing ice from our ancient refrigerator and pressing it against my swollen jaw. "Some guys from East Side thought I was talking to their girlfriends or something. You know how it is." The excuse came easily after months of practice, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't buying it anymore. What he didn't know was that I'd been working for Marcus Antonelli for the past 6 months, collecting gambling debts and running packages for the most dangerous man in our part of the city. It started when our electricity got shut off, and my father couldn't afford the reconnection fee on his mechanic's salary. Marcus had offered me $200 to deliver an envelope across town, and I'd been stupid enough to think it was just a one-time thing. But Marcus Antonelli didn't deal in one-time favors, and once you were on his payroll, getting out wasn't a choice you got to make for yourself. What began as simple deliveries had escalated into collections, intimidation, and eventually the kind of work that left you with broken ribs and black eyes when debtors decided to fight instead of pay. "Alex," my father said, setting down his mug with hands that trembled slightly from too many double shifts and not enough sleep, "I got a call from Detective Rivera today. She said there's been some gang activity in our neighborhood, and she wanted to know if we'd seen anything unusual. She specifically asked about you." My stomach dropped like I'd been punched. Detective Rivera had been investigating Marcus's organization for months, and if she was asking about me specifically, it meant someone had given her my name. Either a rival organization was trying to eliminate Marcus's people by feeding information to law enforcement, or someone in Marcus's crew was cooperating with police to reduce their own charges. "What did you tell her?" I asked, trying to sound casual while my mind raced through the implications. If Detective Rivera had enough evidence to start questioning family members, then Marcus's entire operation was probably under surveillance, and if I was identified as one of his collectors, both my father and I could become targets for retaliation. "I told her you were a good kid who went to school and came home every night," my father said. "But Alex, she showed me photos of you talking to people I don't recognize. Expensive cars, grown men in suits, meetings in parking lots that don't look like innocent conversations." His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath it. The photos meant that law enforcement had been watching Marcus's operation for longer than anyone realized, and they'd been documenting every interaction his people had with civilians. If Detective Rivera had pictures of me conducting business, then she also had pictures of every debt collection I'd made and every package I'd delivered for the past 6 months. "Dad, some situations are more complicated than they look," I said carefully, knowing that telling him the truth would probably get both of us killed. "Sometimes people get involved in things because they don't have better options available." It was as close to honesty as I dared get, without signing our death warrants. My father stood up slowly, his back stiff from years of crawling under cars and lifting heavy parts. He walked to our kitchen window and pulled back the curtain to look out at the street below our apartment. "There's a van parked across from our building," he said quietly. "Same van, same location, for the past 4 nights. Government plates." Federal surveillance meant that this investigation was bigger than just Marcus's local operation. The FBI only got involved when organized crime crossed state lines or involved serious federal crimes like drug trafficking or money laundering. If they were watching our apartment, it meant they thought I had information valuable enough to justify the resources. "Maybe they're watching someone else in the building," I suggested, but even I didn't believe that anymore. Our building was full of working-class families who couldn't afford to get involved in anything that would attract federal attention. The surveillance was definitely focused on me, which meant my association with Marcus had made me a person of interest in a major investigation. "Alex, I need you to tell me the truth about what's been happening to you," my father said, turning from the window with an expression I'd never seen before. "Because if you're in trouble with people who hurt 17-year-old kids for fun, then we need to figure out how to get you out of that situation before it gets worse." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Need to see you tonight. Urgent business. Usual place in 1 hour." The timing couldn't have been worse, but ignoring Marcus's summons wasn't an option if I wanted to stay alive long enough to figure out how to escape his organization. "I have to go out for a while," I said, grabbing my jacket from the chair where I'd thrown it. "It's important, and I can't put it off until tomorrow." The explanation was pathetic, but it was better than admitting that my boss in organized crime needed to discuss urgent business at midnight. "You're not going anywhere," my father said firmly, positioning himself between me and the front door. "Not until you explain what kind of urgent business a high school student has at midnight on a school night." His tone carried the authority he'd used when I was younger and easier to control. That's when someone knocked on our door. 3 sharp raps, pause, 2 more raps. It was the signal Marcus's people used to identify themselves and avoid confusion with law enforcement or rival organizations. My father and I looked at each other, both understanding that our conversation was about to become academic. "Stay in the kitchen," I whispered, moving toward the door. "Whatever happens, don't get involved." I opened it to find Tommy Marcelli, one of Marcus's lieutenants, standing in our hallway with 2 other men I didn't recognize. Tommy was maybe 40 years old, with scarred knuckles and dead eyes that had seen too much violence. "Alex, boss wants to see you," Tommy said without preamble. "There's been some complications with the Rivera situation, and he needs to discuss your role in resolving them." His tone was friendly but urgent, and the 2 guys behind him looked like they solved problems with violence first and questions later. "Let me get my shoes," I said, trying to buy time to figure out what to tell my father. But Tommy shook his head and stepped into our apartment uninvited, his eyes scanning our living room like he was assessing potential threats or escape routes. "No time for shoes," he said. "Boss doesn't like to be kept waiting when federal agents are asking questions about his business operations." Then he noticed my father standing in the kitchen doorway, and his expression shifted to something more calculating and dangerous. "This is my father," I said quickly, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated. "Dad, these are some friends from school who need help with a project." It was a ridiculous cover story, but it was better than explaining that Tommy Marcelli was a career criminal who'd probably killed more people than my father had fixed cars. Tommy studied my father with the same predatory attention a shark uses to evaluate potential prey. "Nice to meet you, sir," he said with false politeness. "Alex has been very helpful with our project. We just need him for a few hours tonight to finish up some details." "What kind of project requires 3 grown men to collect a 17-year-old at midnight?" my father asked, his hand moving toward his back pocket where I knew he kept a small knife he'd carried since his army days. The gesture was subtle, but Tommy noticed it immediately. "The kind that pays well and keeps families safe," Tommy replied, his smile never wavering, but his voice taking on a harder edge. "I'm sure you understand the importance of young people taking advantage of opportunities for financial advancement." The threat was delivered politely, but it was still a threat. That's when the 2 men behind Tommy moved slightly apart, giving themselves better angles if the situation turned violent. My father noticed the movement and shifted his weight forward, preparing to fight if necessary. The entire apartment had become a powder keg, waiting for someone to light the fuse. "It's okay, Dad," I said, stepping between them before anyone could make a move that would get us both killed. "This is just business stuff. I'll be back in a few hours." It was another lie in a conversation full of lies, but it was the only thing I could think of that might prevent bloodshed in our living room. My father looked at me for a long moment, his eyes conveying a message I couldn't quite interpret. Then he nodded slowly and stepped back, but his hand remained near his concealed weapon. "Be careful," he said simply, "and remember what I taught you about making smart choices." What he'd taught me was that family loyalty and personal integrity were more important than money or convenience. But following that advice in Marcus Antonelli's world might get both of us murdered, and I wasn't sure my father understood the difference between standing up to neighborhood bullies and standing up to organized crime. Tommy led me downstairs to a black SUV idling in front of our building. The 2 other men took positions on either side of me, making it clear that this was an escort rather than a friendly ride to a business meeting. As we drove through the city toward Marcus's headquarters, I tried to prepare for whatever conversation was waiting for me. "Boss is concerned about the federal investigation," Tommy explained as we navigated through late-night traffic. "Specifically, he's worried about what you might tell Detective Rivera if she decides to apply pressure." The implication was clear. Marcus was questioning my loyalty and considering whether I posed a security risk to his organization. "I haven't told anyone anything," I said truthfully, "and I'm not planning to cooperate with any investigation." But even as I said it, I knew that promises of loyalty meant very little when federal agents started offering witness protection and reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. "That's good to hear," Tommy said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Because disloyalty has consequences in this organization, and those consequences extend to family members who might be tempted to seek revenge or justice." The message was unmistakable. Betraying Marcus would result in retaliation against my father. The SUV pulled into an industrial area I'd visited several times before, stopping at a warehouse that served as Marcus's primary meeting location for sensitive business discussions. But tonight felt different from my previous visits. There were more cars in the parking area, and I could see armed men positioned at strategic points around the building. Tommy led me through a side entrance into a conference room where Marcus was waiting with 4 other men I recognized as his top lieutenants. The atmosphere was tense, and everyone looked like they were preparing for war rather than conducting routine business. Marcus gestured for me to sit in the chair across from him. "Alex," Marcus said, his voice carrying the controlled calm that meant someone was about to be hurt very badly. "Detective Rivera has been asking some very specific questions about our organization's activities, and some of those questions suggest she has inside information about our operations." His dark eyes fixed on me like laser sights. "Yes, sir," I said, trying to project confidence while my stomach churned with anxiety. Tommy mentioned that there might be some concerns about the investigation. It was a neutral response that didn't admit guilt, but also didn't sound evasive or disrespectful. "What I need to know," Marcus continued, leaning forward slightly, "is whether you've had any contact with federal law enforcement that you haven't reported to this organization. Because if Detective Rivera approaches you with offers of protection or immunity, I need to know about it immediately." The question hung in the air like a loaded gun, and I realized that Marcus suspected I might already be cooperating with the investigation. If he thought I was feeding information to Detective Rivera, then this meeting wasn't about planning strategy. It was about determining whether I needed to be eliminated as a security threat. "Mr. Antonelli, I've had no contact with Detective Rivera or anyone else in law enforcement," I said carefully. "If anyone approaches me with offers or threats, you'll be the first person I contact." It was the truth, but I could see that Marcus wasn't entirely satisfied with my response. "That's reassuring," Marcus said, sliding a photograph across the table. "Because this surveillance photo shows you having coffee with Detective Rivera's partner, Agent Thompson, at the diner on Maple Street last Friday afternoon." The photograph was clear enough to identify both faces, and I felt the blood drain from my head. Agent Thompson had approached me at the diner while I was waiting for a collection target who never showed up. He'd claimed to be an insurance investigator looking into a car accident, and had asked several questions about local businesses that had seemed routine at the time. I'd had no idea he was federal law enforcement. He said he was investigating an insurance claim, I explained, feeling the walls closing in around me. Asked questions about traffic patterns and business hours in the neighborhood. I thought he was legitimate. But looking at the photograph, I realized how that conversation must have appeared to anyone watching from a distance. Agent Thompson specializes in recruiting young informants from criminal organizations, Marcus said quietly. He approaches targets in public places, establishes rapport through seemingly innocent conversations, and then gradually increases contact until he can make formal offers of cooperation. The explanation hit me like a physical blow. "I didn't give him any information about our organization," I said desperately. Everything I told him was general knowledge about the neighborhood, but I couldn't remember exactly what I'd said during that conversation, and general knowledge could still be valuable to federal investigators building a case. Marcus studied me for several long moments, his expression unreadable. The other men in the room remained silent, but I could feel their attention focused on me like spotlights. Finally, Marcus leaned back in his chair and made a decision that would determine whether I left this meeting alive. "I believe you're telling the truth about not intentionally cooperating," he said, and I felt some of the tension leave my body. "But Alex, your inexperience has created a serious vulnerability for this organization. The federal investigation now has intelligence about our operations that they wouldn't have obtained without your unknowing assistance. What can I do to fix it?" I asked, knowing that Marcus wouldn't have brought me here just to explain the problem. He had something in mind that would either redeem my mistake or serve as punishment for my stupidity, and I probably wasn't going to like either option. "Detective Rivera and Agent Thompson are planning to approach you directly within the next week," Marcus said, sliding another document across the table. "They're going to offer you witness protection and immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony about this organization's activities. We're going to use that approach to our advantage." I looked at the document and saw what appeared to be federal surveillance reports detailing planned approaches to potential informants. The level of detail suggested that Marcus had his own sources inside law enforcement, which meant this entire situation was more complicated than I'd understood. "You want me to pretend to cooperate?" I asked, though I suspected the plan was more complex than simple deception. Marcus didn't do anything simple when complicated approaches might yield better results or provide additional leverage for future operations. I want you to actually cooperate, Marcus said, and my blood ran cold. But you're going to provide them with information that helps our organization rather than hurting it. Specifically, you're going to help us identify other federal informants and surveillance operations targeting our business interests. The plan was diabolically clever, but potentially suicidal for anyone involved in its execution. Marcus wanted me to become a double agent, feeding false information to federal investigators while gathering intelligence about their investigation methods and other sources. If either side discovered the deception, I would be killed immediately. And if something goes wrong? I asked. If the federal agents figure out I'm feeding them false information, or if they have ways of verifying what I tell them. The questions needed to be asked, even though Marcus probably wouldn't appreciate my lack of confidence in his strategy. Then you'll die serving this organization, Marcus said matter-of-factly. But if the plan works, you'll have proven your value beyond any doubt, and your family will be under our permanent protection. The offer of protection for my father was both a promise and a threat. I thought about my father sitting in our apartment, probably watching the street for surveillance vans and wondering if his son was coming home alive. I thought about the choices that had led me to this moment, and the choices that would determine whether either of us had a future worth living. When do we start? I asked, knowing that once I committed to this path, there would be no turning back. Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd entered the warehouse, and I realized that he'd never really given me a choice in the matter. The next week passed in a haze of preparation and anxiety. Marcus's people equipped me with recording devices and coached me on techniques for gathering intelligence while appearing to cooperate with federal investigators. The plan was sophisticated, but it relied on my ability to deceive people whose job was detecting deception. On Thursday morning, Detective Rivera finally made her approach. I was walking home from school when she pulled up in an unmarked police car and asked if I had time for a conversation. Everything about the encounter felt scripted, like she'd been planning this moment for weeks. "Alex, I think you know why I want to talk to you," she said, as we sat in her car outside a coffee shop downtown. "You've been associated with some people who are involved in very serious criminal activities, and those associations are going to cause problems for you if we can't work something out." "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, following Marcus's instructions to appear confused rather than defensive. "I know some people from the neighborhood, but I don't know anything about criminal activities." The response sounded rehearsed even to my own ears. Detective Rivera pulled out a file folder containing surveillance photos that showed me conducting collections and deliveries for Marcus's organization. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but she presented it in a way that suggested she wanted to help me rather than prosecute me. "Alex, these photos show you involved in activities that could result in federal charges for conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering," she said gently. "But you're 17 years old, and I don't think you understand what you've gotten yourself into. I want to help you get out of this situation before it destroys your life." The offer sounded genuine, but I knew that Marcus's people were monitoring this conversation through the recording devices they'd given me. Every word I said was being analyzed for signs of disloyalty or cooperation with law enforcement, and my responses would determine whether I survived the next 24 hours. "If I was involved in anything illegal," I said carefully, "what kind of help would be available to someone in my situation?" It was the question Marcus had coached me to ask, designed to gather information about federal witness protection programs and prosecution strategies. Detective Rivera's face lit up with hope, clearly believing that I was considering cooperation. She spent the next 30 minutes explaining witness protection procedures, immunity agreements, and the support available to young people who testified against criminal organizations. Every detail she provided was exactly what Marcus needed to plan his counter-strategies. "There's something else you should know," Detective Rivera said, as our conversation neared its end. "We have evidence that Marcus Antonelli has been planning to eliminate several people in his organization who might pose security risks. Your name is on that list, Alex. He's not going to protect you. He's planning to kill you." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, even though part of me had suspected it might be true. Marcus's protection had always come with expiration dates, and people who knew too much about his operations rarely lived long enough to become problems. If Detective Rivera was telling the truth, then I was already a dead man walking. "How do I know you're not lying to make me cooperate?" I asked, though the question felt hollow. The recording devices Marcus's people had given me were capturing every word of this conversation, which meant my death sentence was being documented in real time if Detective Rivera was right about his intentions. She showed me another surveillance photo, this one taken 3 days earlier outside Marcus's warehouse. It showed him talking to two men I didn't recognize, both carrying what appeared to be weapons. The timestamp indicated the meeting had taken place just hours after my last report to Marcus about the federal investigation. "Those men are professional killers," Detective Rivera explained. "They specialize in eliminating security risks for criminal organizations. Marcus hired them to handle what he calls his informant problem, and you're at the top of his list of potential problems." I left that meeting with my head spinning and my stomach churning with fear. The recording devices Marcus had given me had captured Detective Rivera's offer of protection and her warning about assassination plans. When I played back the recordings for Marcus's people that evening, I would essentially be signing my own death warrant. But I didn't have a choice. Failing to report the conversation would be interpreted as betrayal, and betrayal would result in immediate retaliation against both me and my father. Either way, we were both dead, unless I could find a third option that Marcus hadn't considered. That night, I sat in my bedroom staring at the recording devices and trying to figure out how to survive the next 24 hours. If I gave the recordings to Marcus, he would know that Detective Rivera had warned me about his assassination plans. If I didn't give him the recordings, he would assume I was cooperating with federal investigators. Finally, I made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water at the bottom. I destroyed the recording devices and prepared to tell Marcus that Detective Rivera had been suspicious of electronic surveillance and had insisted on meeting in a location that interfered with recording equipment. The lie would probably get me killed, but it was better than the certainty of death that came with either alternative. At least this way, I had a chance of buying enough time to find a real solution to the impossible situation Marcus had created for both me and my father. The next morning, I met with Tommy Marcelli to report on my conversation with Detective Rivera. I explained that she'd offered witness protection in exchange for testimony, but that technical problems had prevented me from recording the specific details of her proposal. Tommy's expression told me he wasn't entirely convinced. "Boss wants to see you tonight," Tommy said after I finished my report. "He has some additional instructions for your next meeting with Detective Rivera." The words sounded routine, but Tommy's tone suggested that Marcus had decided I was no longer useful to his organization. That afternoon, my father was waiting for me when I got home from school. He was sitting at our kitchen table with a small pile of cash and 2 bus tickets to a city I'd never visited. His expression was grim but determined, like he'd made a decision he didn't like but couldn't avoid. "We're leaving tonight," he said without preamble. "I don't know what kind of trouble you're in, but I know it's the kind that gets people killed if they don't disappear fast enough." The bus tickets were for a departure at midnight, which gave us barely enough time to pack essential belongings and escape. "Dad, we can't just run away," I said, though part of me was relieved that he'd finally acknowledged the danger we were both in. "The people I work for don't forgive disloyalty, and running away would be interpreted as the worst possible betrayal." "Then we don't run away," my father said, pulling out his cell phone. "We go to the federal agents and tell them everything you know about Marcus Antonelli's organization. Full cooperation in exchange for protection for both of us." It was the solution I'd been afraid to consider, but it was probably our only chance of survival. 2 hours later, Detective Rivera and Agent Thompson met us at a safe house outside the city. My father sat beside me as I told them everything I knew about Marcus's operations, his personnel, his methods, and his plans for eliminating federal informants. The information I provided would probably destroy his organization completely. "Marcus is planning to kill several people tonight," I explained, "including me, because he thinks I might cooperate with your investigation. If you move fast enough, you can arrest him before he eliminates the evidence and the witnesses." The timeline was tight, but federal agents moved faster than criminal organizations when they had probable cause. Within 6 hours, Marcus Antonelli and 17 members of his organization were under arrest on federal charges ranging from racketeering to murder conspiracy. The simultaneous raids were coordinated across multiple locations, preventing anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. My father and I spent the next 3 months in witness protection while federal prosecutors built their cases using the information I'd provided. Marcus was eventually sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, effectively ending his criminal empire and eliminating the threat to our lives. We relocated to a small city in another state where my father found work at a garage that specialized in classic car restoration. I finished high school and earned a scholarship to study criminal justice, with the goal of eventually working to prevent other teenagers from getting trapped in situations like mine. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking about the choices I made and the consequences that followed. But my father and I are both alive, which is more than could have been said if we'd stayed in Marcus Antonelli's world for much longer. The black eyes healed completely, but the lessons about loyalty, courage, and the cost of survival stayed with me forever.